So, okay. And still waiting for your screen to come up, Laura. I see your cursor. There we go. Okay, take it away, Laura. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Doug, and thanks everyone for calling in today on the monthly webinar. As Doug said, I'm a state climatologist for South Dakota, working with Extension and based out of Aberdeen in the northeastern part of the state. And you'll kind of see later the epicenter, perhaps, of the wettest area of the region, but we'll get to that in a little bit. First of all, some general information just regarding the webinars. Our next webinar in November will be presented by Pat Gannon, Missouri State Climatologist, and as always, they're archived at both the High Plains Regional Climate Center and the Midwest Regional Climate Center websites afterwards, so you can share them from there. So our agenda for today, first, looking at our recent or current conditions. I won't get into impacts too much, particularly on the agricultural side, as Brad will address those in the second half of the webinar, but I'll talk a little bit about that. And then, as Doug mentioned too, I'll get into the outlooks, starting in the near term, in the next week or 2 weeks, and heading out through the winter season. Those were all updated just this morning. And just wanted to share a local picture here from near Aberdeen with the corn in snow from this last weekend. All the snow here is melted for the most part, but I know up north in North Dakota, they still have some standing snow out there. So, and as you can see, the green tint on the corn wasn't quite dried down yet before we got that hard freeze and snow. So I think we're yet to be determined how bad or what that might mean for final numbers on harvest and yield and all that kind of thing. So a quick look at recent conditions. Again, this is just across the street from that cornfield over the weekend where soybeans enshrouded in snow. And looking, just a comment here when I was preparing these slides that I noticed last year this time at the October webinar, which I also hosted or presented for you guys, I had a very similar picture from Nebraska showing soybeans in snow and combines in snow. And so it's been 2 years in a row that we've had snow essentially on October 10th to 18th around that time in this region. First, looking at the month of September, that's the last full month of data that we have with NOAA and NCEI. Typically we show the state level maps, but I found this a little more interesting to show the counties to get a little more local into how we ranked as far as temperature goes. You can see some real hot spots there in the maroon colors with the record warmest September in some of our areas, but again, those deeper orange colors as well, many of those ranked, in the top 5 or 10 or so in 125 years of record. So really unusually warm compared to what we've seen much of this year so far. We've had a lot of cooler or moderate temperatures. A lot of the average temperatures actually were driven by high minimum temperatures, not so much the high daytime temperatures in September. Looking at the growing season so far and kind of leading into what Brad will talk about later, here's our growing season since April, and this is the statewide numbers here. And you could see the north central states from Montana to Wisconsin down to Kansas, really closer towards average. The number there will tell you how each state ranks in 125 years of record. So you can see the eastern part of our region here in the central region is more on the warmer side, and the northern western states more moderate for the growing season so far. On the precipitation side, as far as ranking goes, again, looking at the county level information, you can see the very wet areas up in Montana, North Dakota, Minnesota, and so on. And what we have found really unique is, particularly in the state of Illinois, where you have one county way in the northwest part of the state all the way down to a county in the southeast part of the state, both showing records, but the northwest showing record wettest, the southeast showing record driest within the same state. And we've heard these comments, you know, with the very wet conditions in the northwest and how dry it's been down in the Ohio River Valley. But certainly maps like these really tell that story of how tight that gradient is, or how rapid those transitions are, just on a statewide basis, from north to south in this case. So here it does illustrate the dryness and the drought concerns that have been in the eastern part of our region, and certainly the excess moisture concerns up in the Missouri River Basin and on the western part of our region in the last month or so. And here, looking at growing season so far, April to September, my state here, South Dakota, sticks out kind of as a sore thumb with the record wettest April through September on record. It looks like some data I looked at yesterday showing that we are on par, less than an inch away from our record wettest year of January through December, and we still have about 2.5 months left in the year. So I think certainly we're going to see a new record set here in South Dakota, but there's a handful that are still much above average, as you see a lot of greens across the region. So certainly that has been one of the key stories of this season so far. Looking more recently at the last 30 days, so basically since our last webinar here with you, looking at temperatures here, departure from normal to start with over the last 30 days, you can see the cooler colors, the greens, blues, purples, out in the western, northwestern part of this region. Warmer temperatures compared to average from Missouri to Ohio and over Kentucky as well, with some much above warmer temperatures of 8 to 10 degrees or so over the last 30 days. So really the exceptional warmth over the last month has been very noted, and with several record temperatures right in that first few days of October in the Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky region as well, to kind of start off the month of October. And here, looking at the last 30 days on precipitation, this is now looking at percent of normal. So something in that yellow to light green is closer towards average for the last 30 days. Anything in the reds, oranges are drier than average. Blues, purples, wetter than average. And you can see the color scale. There's a lot of purples and blues out there, and some pinks even, as we look across the region, especially the northern states of Montana, North Dakota, getting quite a bit of rain and snow more recently, and through Iowa, southern Wisconsin, northern Illinois as well. Drier conditions, though noted in Colorado for the most part, and slightly drier conditions there in Indiana and Ohio. Seems like they've had a little moisture lately, but in general, those dry conditions continue across that area. And looking at soil moisture, this very much reflects our very wet conditions from precipitation, in that, and this isn't probably a new story for many of us, where we've seen above average soil moisture as well, which is driving a lot of the flood concerns in the area's rivers and streams. As any moisture that we get as rainfall, there's just no capacity, or very little capacity in the soils now to take up that moisture. So we get high runoff generated with relatively low precipitation. So this is one of the concerns, I think, even going forward into the winter season, as a lot of the soil moisture as we get into the cold season could essentially freeze in place. If you imagine a sponge totally soaked up with water and you put it in the freezer, try to pour water on it again after it's frozen and it just runs off. And so I think this is one of the concerns as we get into the agricultural stories for the winter into the spring season as well, given these current soil moisture conditions going into the cold season. And again, like I said, the runoff and stream flow across the region is very high in the northern states and through the upper Mississippi Basin as well. You see some of those oranges and red colors over in the Ohio that have been on the dry side, but have also had a little bit of recovery in some of those areas more recently. But so we see still a pretty wet area there with high stream flow for this time of year compared to that area that's been very dry in the east. And we've seen this a lot lately here since the mid part of the season, of the summer season. Let's see here. Looking at now more on the dry side than the wet side, we've talked about all the excess moisture we've had. Looking at the U.S. Drought Monitor, just taking a snapshot of our central region up here. Colorado continues to see drought conditions of moderate to severe in their southwestern part of their state, also part of western Kansas as well. And then, as I've mentioned a few times here, the Ohio River Basin that's been struggling with drought conditions for a little bit of time here during this growing season. Looking at the change in the Drought Monitor's classes or categories in the last 4 weeks, we've seen increases or increase in severity of drought, both in some areas, and also severity, again, in the Colorado, Kansas area and the Ohio River Basin area, but also improvements across those states from Iowa and up over Lake Michigan and into Michigan. So, and also in the far western side of the region in Wyoming and Montana, also improvement in dry or drought conditions over there, where essentially there's no residual dryness concerns, at least as far as the Drought Monitor goes at this point. All right, so talking a little bit about impacts, I think the story here recently has been the cold temperatures and very high water levels. And here we are getting into our frost season now, and much of the region has had a 32-degree frost or freeze temperature, however you'd like to say it. The medium greens are sometime in the middle of October, the 11th to 20th or so within the last week. And the darker green would have been in the first 10 days or so of October, the first third of October. So most of the area in the central, northern, western side of the region has already seen a 32-degree freeze. And some pockets still from Illinois to Ohio and Kentucky have seen those frost temperatures already. Looking at the hard freeze, what I call a hard freeze or a killing freeze at 28 degrees, that's been a little more held back to the western part of our region. And again, most of this was just since October 1st. And at least in my area, it's been essentially near the median or average date for a hard freeze. So not especially early or late, just kind of near average. But given how slow our growing season started and how slow gardens and yards and everything started. We've seen already some impacts from things freezing a little prematurely before they were fully mature. So looking at, or talking about a couple of the river systems in our region, first on the Missouri River, there was an update with just about a week ago with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who manages the dams on the river, and they have updated their forecast runoff on October 1st, now up to 61 million acre feet as their estimated annual runoff by the time this calendar year is done. If that is achieved, that is the same as 2011, which is the current record holder for the Missouri system and over 120 years of record. So that's quite incredible, the amount of water that system is moving through the region here. Just looking at September, one interesting tidbit here is looking at the runoff from the eastern South Dakota rivers. If you're familiar, that'd be the James, Vermilion, and Big Sioux. All three of those go into the Missouri downstream of the last dam. So there's no dam to control that runoff in eastern South Dakota into the Missouri. And that runoff was 16 times average in the month of September and twice the previous record. So really a very large amount of water, and given the current situation in October, they had estimated about 3 times average to be the runoff in October, and I believe that has been holding true so far in the first couple weeks of the month. No question they're going to need to continue some high releases through the system to move that water through before there's a freeze up way up north in Fort Peck and in the northern larger reservoirs in the cold zone, so to speak, in North Dakota and Montana. And looking a little further east here at the north central region at the River Forecast Center, this is their area of responsibility here, that you could see a lot of the reds, purples, and oranges. First through the Mississippi River as you get through Iowa and Missouri, that there's still a lot of portions of that river in flood stage or very high flood stage, major to moderate. Similar up north in North Dakota, the Red River of the North, which flows northward, also in major or moderate flood stage, as there was some significant precipitation there in September and then again more recently in October, and all that water is moving towards the river up there as well. So the Missouri River is not alone in how much water has, how much precipitation has fallen in the basin. The Ohio River, as we've seen, was running near average or on the dry side compared to this time of year, but then they've had a little recent rain to get closer up to and maintain in the average range more recently. And talking about lakes now, not so much rivers, but lakes, here's a couple snapshots of Great Lake levels. Looking at the blue lines, that's the current year so far. The black squiggly line is last year. So you can see, and this was true for their master stations that they have noted on the Great Lakes. And so all of the lakes at their master stations anyway are showing above average lake levels. One of the concerns here is when you have high wind events that can create problems on shorelines with large waves and causing some damage or flooding along shorelines. So when you have very high lake levels, that's one of the issues there. I also have heard and seen many other lakes in Minnesota, South Dakota, and around the region, North Dakota, have high lake levels as well. Lake of the Woods is one of them up in northern Minnesota on the Canadian border. And a lot of the glacial lakes in eastern South Dakota as well have been running very high for much of the season. And so, again, we have a lot of moisture out there right now that could cause some issues if they freeze in place, especially some of the smaller lakes out here that do freeze over. That could cause some problems as we get into the winter season if the lake levels continue to stay high. One benefit, perhaps, of all the moisture we've seen is that the mosquitoes that carry West Nile virus don't like really excess wet conditions. And so maybe on the plus side, we could see it's been a very low year for West Nile virus, as that mosquito species really prefers drier, more concentrated pools of water. And I believe last I heard there may be only 10 cases in South Dakota, which is really, really low for us. Very few of the counties here have even more than a few West Nile cases reported so far this year. So you see more of the concentrated areas, maybe in Colorado, where they had a little drier conditions. But in general, a very quiet year for West Nile virus. Not to say we didn't have mosquitoes, just not the right ones that carry that virus. So looking out ahead towards the climate outlooks, again, I'll start with the near term, the next week or two, and look further ahead then for the next month or several months. We'll start with this from the Weather Prediction Center at NOAA. This would be the total precipitation forecast for the next 7 days. So from now till next week, early Thursday next week, and showing, some moisture conditions coming through. I know up here we're expecting maybe a couple rounds of storms or of rainfall, maybe early next week and then later next week. So, but in general, the amounts in the blues to purples are, half an inch to an inch and a half. Some pockets may see more than that, but in general, we don't see one big gully washer, for example, coming down the pike, at least in the next 7 days. Looking out a little further than that, in the 8 to 14 day window, so 1 to 2 weeks from now, starting on the left, you see the temperature probability with odds leaning towards cooler than average temperatures all across our region here in that 8 to 14 day window. On the right side, little different story here with precipitation, where much of the region is favored to be drier than average in the beige and orange colors. But some areas such as Montana, Dakotas, and Wyoming may slightly lean towards better conditions, and the far northern Great Lakes or eastern Ohio, eastern Michigan might also be favored towards wetter conditions in that 8 to 14 day period. So again, after that next 7 day, it looks like a dry down for much of the region, perhaps. And now for the outlooks that came out this morning, looking at November to start with. Here on the left is temperature, with odds slightly favoring warmer than average temperatures for much of the region, with the exception of Montana, which is mostly in equal chances of warmer, cooler, or near average temperatures for the month ahead. And parts of northern Minnesota also have slightly higher odds than the rest of us, but just slightly leaning towards warmer than average, perhaps in November. On the right side here is precipitation, and I think there the area in green is the area to note where, again, odds are favoring or leaning towards wetter than average conditions, mostly over Wyoming, South Dakota, Nebraska, and northern Kansas and Colorado. So the Southwest states slightly favored to be drier than average in November. So keeping that in mind, looking further ahead, November through January, kind of taking those 3 months all together, this is what the updated temperature and precipitation outlooks show with, again, starting on the left, most of the country actually, with odds favoring towards warmer than average conditions, with the exception of part of our north central region up here over Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, Michigan, and Indiana, where there's equal chances right now of below average, above average, or near average temperature in that 3-month period overall. So you can still see a lot of ups and downs perhaps throughout that early winter season, but in general, not a clear consensus on what the temperatures may be overall there. And then on the right side, I think is another story to tell here with continued probability leaning towards wetter than average conditions, again, for much of our western region here and as we get into that winter season. So, it's kind of saying the same story over and over with we've got wet conditions and more wet coming, and that's kind of what it looks like here at this point, as the models are getting to be relatively consistent on that wet pattern, at least through the northern states. And here looking one step further ahead, again, this is a 3-month outlook for December through February. So looking at December, January, February, I'll pull together. That white area on the left broadens up a bit, equal chances of warmer, cooler, or near average conditions for much of our region up here, with the southern, kind of all around us leaning towards warmer, more likely leaning towards warmer for that December through February period. And then as I just mentioned previously too, that a lot of the models are starting to hone in and forecasters are starting to hone in on wetter than average conditions favored across the northern tier states from Montana to the Great Lakes. And so that's what we see here. Looks like that also carries through into the later winter and early spring outlooks as well. So if you go to that website, you can see those outlooks further out into the spring. But again, given our current wet conditions across the region, this might not necessarily be what we want to hear at this time. Seasonal drought outlook, which also was released this morning. This is valid through the end of January. They're showing in those olive green colors in the Ohio River Basin that drought removal is likely. That would be on the drought monitor going down to D0 or no drought no dryness at all. Out in Colorado, kind of a mixed bag. Some persisting drought and some removal of drought potentially. They did get a really good start to the snow water year with that big system that came through again last week. So it looks like they're off to a good start, but there's a lot of water year and snow season still ahead of us. So crossing fingers that they can make it through it and get some improvement in their snowpack for their runoff season next spring. We did hear that there is at least one ski resort that opened up early. At least they were able to make snow with some cold temperatures up there. So that's maybe another sign that winter is coming very soon. So as I kind of race through all that, again, if you want to check out some past webinars or see the recording of this one later, and there are a handful of links here to other resources regarding to climate, drought, and our regional climate centers and state climatologists. So do please check those out at your leisure. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me or any of the other hosts here after the meeting to ask some questions or just to discuss the climate some more. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to you, Doug, if you're ready, or Brad.
I'm here. I'm just changing over to Brad. And we're sort of answering questions on the fly. I figured out how actually to do that. This webinar, it's taken me like 6 years, but that's interesting. We'll still go through them at the end because I think a lot of the questions will be important or at least interesting to a number of people on the phones. Brad, did you get my invite? Let's see, maybe you're already up.
Oh, I think I'm good to go, and if you can hear me, I will start.
Yep. Okay. Again, Brad Rippey from the USDA. Go ahead, Brad.
All right. Thank you, Doug, and thank you, Laura. Great job on that. And I am Brad Rippey from the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C., also one of the U.S. Drought Monitor authors. And I'm going to go a little bit into the weeds here, so to speak, on agriculture and the very interesting growing season of 2019. Some of the highlights and lowlights of the 2019 U.S. crop season. Of course, the Midwestern planting was severely delayed by wetness, with some of those delays extending across the northern plains and extending down toward the central plains. Of course, on top of weather, we had market factors that were a big role in how things were planted this year. So low commodity prices and a trade war favored producers planting corn instead of soybeans. Typically, in a wet year, you often see an acreage gain on soybeans due to the fact that you can plant soybeans a bit later into the season. That did not happen very much this year, in part because there was so much storage on farm due to the fact that China was not buying soybeans. So that really upended the entire planting season as well. U.S. corn production in 2019, as of October 1st estimates, so this does not include the recent snowstorm or cold outbreak, down 4.4% from last year. Despite very little change in area harvested, the yield is down 8 bushels an acre nationally, 4.5% down from last year. The big bump was in soybean production, down 20% from last year. Much of that decline attributable to the decrease in harvested acres or anticipated harvested acres, but some 7.3% was due to a yield decline, fairly sharp from last year. And as of the most recent USDA report, just over half of the U.S. corn and soybeans rated good to excellent, compared to 68 and 66% respectively at the same time a year ago. I borrowed Laura's great picture from her office in Aberdeen. That was taken about a week ago, and that was, I just want to talk about current conditions, things that have happened since October 1st that could impact some of these numbers that I was just showing. And it was an incredible storm. This is basically the state of North Dakota and some of the snowfall totals that were experienced between the 10th and the 13th. We saw roughly the eastern two-thirds of North Dakota picking up anywhere from 1 to locally 3 feet of snow, an incredible early season storm that blanketed crops and provided a ton of moisture that is going to have trouble working its way through the system as we move into the winter season. And if you look at the bigger picture, there's the snow depth chart on the morning of the 12th. Even some of the major observation sites like Bismarck had impressive totals, 17.1 inches in Bismarck, and Laura's place there at the official site in Aberdeen had 5 inches of snow during that event. Then, of course, that storm was accompanied and trailed by a significant cold outbreak that ended the growing season in most areas from the upper Mississippi Valley westward, temperatures dropping into that 28 or lower threshold that puts the brakes on any further crop development for corn and soybeans. Here we're overlaying minimum temperatures at some of our major observation sites along with major and minor corn production areas. So we will talk about that here in a few slides about possible impacts on some of those immature crops. We did see light freezes extending all the way eastward through much of Wisconsin, Illinois, and even scattered freezing temperatures into Indiana and Ohio down to about the Ohio Valley. Laura talked about the drought monitor, so I won't dwell on this, but just very little drought in the region, just on the southern and eastern fringes down along the Ohio River and in southwest Kansas, and that's about it for drought at this time in mid-October. Big story, though, is the excess or surplus topsoil moisture that we're seeing. And if you look across those northern states from Montana to Michigan, southward to Iowa, we're seeing topsoil moisture ratings from USDA at least 30% surplus to a nation high 62% in North Dakota as of October 13th. And again, whether that gets frozen into the system or partially runs off will have some impacts on possible spring planting issues as we move forward, especially as Laura mentioned in those outlooks, we maintain a snowy or wet pattern all the way through the winter months. On the flip side, very little to talk about in terms of very short to short numbers unless you go to the southern and eastern fringes, the same areas that are experiencing some drought. We've got topsoil moisture roughly half or more very short to short in states like Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky at this time, despite some of the recent rainfall that we've seen there to help alleviate some of the autumn dryness that developed there. Now, getting to some of the crop specifics, Risk Management Agency from USDA put out this chart showing the indemnities or losses county level here. And what you can see here is some of the areas that really struggled to do planting at all in the spring of 2019. So we're talking more than $10 million in overall crop indemnities. So if you look at the southeastern part of North Dakota, down through eastern South Dakota, southwestern Minnesota, another pocket in northern Illinois, and another area centered on northwestern Ohio, those are some of the areas that struggled the most with the wetness and the issues that occurred in the spring and early summer of 2019. If you break it down and look at prevented planting, the threshold's a little bit lower here. It's about 1.5 million if you look at the legend there on the lower right. But again, it just kind of highlights the issues that we had with the wetness, lack of planting, and just going to a prevented plant in so many areas of the Corn Belt, with the biggest focus on the areas that I just mentioned through the eastern Dakotas, southwestern Minnesota, and the other pockets in Illinois, northwestern Ohio. One of the big hallmarks of this growing season was with the late planting, and this is a national product here, but it shows how the Midwest kind of swayed this a little bit because we did have delays also extending into the Delta and back across the Great Plains. So overall normalized difference vegetation index, or NDVI, shows that delay compared to the normal curve and especially compared to last year when you're looking at some of the crop development. And so when you look at some of the related products like the Vegetation Health Index, you can really see all the way up through late July and early August, you see a signal that shows stress in the Midwest. What that actually was the fact that the canopy of corn and soybeans was simply not up to the normal pace at that point. And so it shows up as crop stress. And so some of these same areas that we talked about before, especially there, northwestern Ohio, really stick out like a sore thumb because either acreage was not planted or the canopy had not developed all the way into mid and even late summer. So as you move further west into the grasslands and the wheat country, you get a much brighter or better signal, but that Midwestern signal with the late development and prevented planting is very strong this year. I'm going to go through some of the individual crops, starting with the big ones. Each crop I will introduce with a slide that looks like this. It shows the 5-year average in terms of the percentage of the U.S. production for that state in yellow. So for example, for this 5-year period, Iowa accounted for 17% of the U.S. production, and then the major and minor areas. So you get that intro slide, and then I'll get to some other information. Corn for grain production in 2019 is pegged at 13.8 billion bushels. If we slide any more in future forecasts moving forward from October 1st, it could possibly be the lowest corn production since the drought year of 2012. At this point, it looks like it'll be the lowest since 2015. Looking at the corn conditions rated good to excellent, this is current, October 13th. You can see the mighty struggle that crops have had in those southeastern Corn Belt states of Illinois, and especially moving into Indiana and Ohio. Only a third of the crop rated in good to excellent condition there, compared to 55% nationally. Corn progress, that of course has been the other part of the story here. Low conditions, slow progress, and the amount of corn fully mature by October 13th is the least amount in the modern record going back to 1995. So looking at a quarter century of data, only 73% mature on this date, October 13th, 2019. Previous record was 77% during a similar type year in 2009. And so if you look at the freeze that occurred in the Dakotas, for example, a few days ago, we only had roughly half or even less of the crop fully mature. With that crop now being stopped in its tracks, you cannot add any more mass to the grain. So any development is halted, terminated at that point. And so that could translate to some yield losses. And in addition, it will require careful handling of the corn that was frozen while still fairly green. So there will be some issues going forward as well. There's the graph of the 25 years showing the similarities between this year and 2009 on the delayed maturity. Really no other comparable year in the last 25. And the corn harvest progress, it is going to be a very slow harvest due to the late maturity, and as you move further north and west, due to the extreme wetness in places like the Dakotas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and even Michigan and Iowa. For soybeans, there's the production areas. And this is, of course, we talked earlier, took the big hit, only 3.55 billion bushels. Looks like it is going to be the lowest soybean production since the post-drought year of 2013. Similar to corn, we have the big problem states being Indiana and Ohio, roughly one-third of the crop rated good to excellent, compared to 54% nationally. And also, like corn, record slow progress, only 85% of the crop dropping leaves by October 13th. Previous record was 1996 at 89%, and that analog year of 2009 coming in third at 91%. The good news here is that as you move to the western part of the corn belt and soybean belt, more of the soybeans were mature than further east. There will certainly be some local problems in states like Wisconsin, Iowa, even perhaps down southward into Missouri and Kansas, but more of the crop was mature than corn at the time of the season-ending freeze across the western and central corn belt. There's your analog to 1996, comparing 2019 in red to the brown 1996 year. Soybean harvest, and look at the upper Midwest there. Progress as of October 13th, more than 40 to more than 50 percentage points behind the typical 5-year average harvest pace in the Dakotas and Minnesota. It is also going to be a very slow soybean harvest, particularly in the northern and western corn belt. Other highlights, just go through 5 crops and pastures real quick. Spring wheat harvest has been delayed due to the snow and wet weather. And by October 13th, there's still 6% of the spring wheat in the field, a record for the date. Never in the last 25 years has there been more spring wheat left to harvest at this time. Sunflower production expected to be up almost 7% from last year, but there are reports that it is going to be extremely difficult to harvest sunflowers, most of which are grown in the Dakotas due to the adverse weather. Winter wheat looks pretty good in most major production areas. Most of it's been planted. A good amount has emerged, but that has been limited in northern areas, especially Montana, by the cold, wet, snowy weather. Sugar beet harvest. A lot of the sugar beets are grown in the Red River Valley of the north. Harvest is underway, but way behind schedule. The overall production estimate is up slightly from last year. Sorghum had a pretty good year, despite a decrease in harvested acreage. And rangeland and pastures, due to the wetness That's actually good for grasses for the most part, unless you have flooding. So if you look at the overall U.S. hay yield, not including alfalfa, up almost 9% from last year. Spring wheat, real quick, I'll touch on that. There's your production areas, and we still have 7% of the crop in the field in North Dakota, 12% in Montana, and it will be a continuing struggle to get that remaining acreage harvested. There have been reports of quality reductions of what's still left in the field. Sunflower seed, this year we're expecting more than 80% of the production to come from the Dakotas. So that's right in the heart of that snow and wet belt there. And in terms of harvest, it has not started yet in South Dakota, typically 14% harvested by this time, and a very slow start for sunflower harvest in North Dakota. For winter wheat, production area is more spread out. The biggest state for production is Kansas. And again, a pretty good start for planting, 2/3 of the crop planted, but behind schedule in Montana, where it typically is planted earlier due to the onset of wintry weather earlier. And then in terms of emergence, again in Montana, a late start on the emergence there. Fortunately, the producers in South Dakota had a brief open window and they were able to get the crop planted and emerged before the adverse weather hit. For sugar beets, again, about half that crop comes from the Red River Valley or more, and it is way behind schedule for the sugar beet harvest due to rain and snow, wetness, and even flooding. About less than 1/3 of the crop harvested by the 13th. It's about half the average pace. And for sorghum, grown mainly from South Dakota southward, pretty good year. Crop is rated 2/3, almost good to excellent, well up from last year. And maturity, though, is lagging, same reasons that we've talked about before, delays in planting earlier in the year. And the harvest, obviously, due to the late maturity, getting off to a slow start across much of the Great Plains. And then for hay, finish up here talking about hay. And again, this does not include alfalfa. Conditions have been very good for most of the year. However, due to excessive wetness and then a bit of drought afterwards, we have seen some sharp pasture condition declines in states like Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. But as you move westward into the more major pasture and rangeland areas of the Great Plains, things are looking good. Grasses like the wet weather unless they're flooded out. And so with that, I think we have plenty of time for questions, and I'll turn it back over to Doug.
Yeah, thank you, Brad. And Laura, if I didn't say thanks before. Let's see, let's leave your slides up just for a moment in case there's a particular question that people want to answer. And I think I'm going to start this question and answer part by hitting on some of the latest questions that we got since you were the speaker, and a lot of them are directed towards you, Brad. Is there a winter wheat crop loss at this time due to adverse weather that we're aware of anyway?
There's nothing that we're aware of. The only thing you'd really be concerned about right now for the crop that has been planted is any effect of the sharp cold snap. But recently emerged winter wheat can withstand temperatures typically below 15 without any significant concern, or down to at least 10 to 15. We did see some temperatures getting down close to that across parts of the central high plains like eastern Colorado, western Kansas. But typically that's not a major concern it might burn back the tips of growth a little bit as it emerges, but we're not expecting any significant problems with the emerging winter wheat crop.
There was a comment yesterday from the Kansas State Climate Office that they're developing dry area in southwestern Kansas. There's a little bit of concern there that they need some moisture for emergence, but I would agree with Brad. We're still too early to say that there's any kind of an issue.
Okay, Brad, again, could you describe again the yield loss for corn crops that are dented but not mature let me start again. Yield loss for corn crops that are dented but not mature, and mature but not harvested due to freeze. Soybean yield loss due to freeze or dropping of leaf stages. In other words, what does all that late harvest stuff mean in this particular year, I think?
Sure. Yeah, with corn, and Dennis may wish to chime in after I'm done, but with corn that has dented but has not reached full maturity, the crop will be able to be harvested without too much difficulty. It may require some extra time. It will require some extra time to dry down either in the field or using a heating mechanism like propane, to run it through a heater to dry it. So there are some handling issues with that crop. And the other thing is when that freeze hits, if it's dented but not fully mature, you halt any accumulation of mass. So what you have at that time of freeze is what you're going to end up with. Now, there was a very small percentage of the crop that had not yet reached the dented stage. There's greater concern for that crop. It's still, the grain is still somewhat soft. It can be kind of turned to mush, and there may be some minor losses where you really can't do anything with that grain. But that was, again, a very, very small percentage of the crop in the far reaches of the Western Corn Belt. Now, for soybeans, if they were still a bit green, again, it's going to require some special handling, some dry down time due to high moisture content. There may be some quality and molding issues as well with that. So careful handling required for not fully mature corn and soybeans. Dennis, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, Brad laid it out pretty well. The problem is you need to handle that, and there was even a recommendation from an Iowa State Extension person who deals with grain quality, seeing if they could get some of that grain that would have more potential issues to handle it completely separately and keep it out of the mainstream, so you could dry it, and then you could still dry it down appropriately and still be able to deal with it. Because if you don't get it dried down right, then it can mold and affect the grain around it. And this can all be handled, but you got to remember what people are making this year in their grain crop is there's not a lot of profit, if any profit this year. So the additional handling, the additional drying costs eat into their profit. So it can be dealt with. It's just more work and more cost.
Yep. Okay. I think one of the questions was which states have suffered the worst crop yield or potential crop yield in the north central plains, and I think you addressed that pretty well in some of the graphics that you showed. Those are early questions, I think.
Yeah, and I think the answer for the north central part of the U.S., it's really too early to determine final losses for crops like spring wheat, sunflowers, sugar beets, and so forth. I know the question was specifically talking about the north central plains, but in terms of Midwestern losses compared to last year, the biggest corn and soybean losses were clearly in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio.
Yeah. It certainly compared to normal, right? So another question here, now we're going to shift gears slightly to flooding, which is because it goes along with the discussion. And Laura, I hope you're still on.
Yeah, I'm still
Are you
here.
There? Okay, good. I'm not aware of the answer to this question. At least I haven't heard anything. But the question is, has there been any discussion from the Army Corps about flood control projects on the eastern side of South Dakota? I'm guessing there's been proposals, but it may not be.
Yeah, and I guess this question does come up, especially in flood years. And I think the answer I've heard is that there just aren't any sites suitable, essentially, given how flat the terrain is out there in those river basins, and that there's really not a good place even to put any control structures of any type out there. And so that's the answer that I've heard and understand. So yeah, I don't know if there's a lot of hope for anything going in on the James, Vermilion, or Big Sioux at the Missouri River.
So I think one of the sort of overriding questions that we haven't really got, well, we've been trying to get to all year, I guess, or been talking around it or talking about it a little bit, is what is sort of the overall level of concern, excuse me, going into, the winter and spring. I tried to say I did answer this question sort of online here, but I would say that there's definitely concern, and to say that it's an elevated concern might be an understatement from some of the folks who forecast at the River Forecast Center. That concern, we saw that map that Laura had up there with almost a large portion of the north central part of the U.S., almost all of the Missouri Basin, not all of it, but most of it, and upper Midwest, all with soil moisture well above normal. And going into the cold season and looking at near normal or equal chances of above near normal or below normal temperatures. If we sort of average our normal temperatures, that means we're going to freeze all that water and in soil, and thus sort of not be able to, anything that falls, whether it's average precipitation or above, which we don't really want, even though that's part of the forecast, will have complications to it. There's just no two ways about that. What we really need is an extended period of dryness, and we need it over a slightly warmer part of the year so that we can dry out those soils a little bit more. Any comments about that? I mean, I'm not predicting a major flood by any means. All I'm saying is conditions are conducive for any sort of above normal precipitation to cause some issues, continuing issues.
Yeah, Doug, I think you're right on there, and given that we're getting in the cold season, there's just no vegetation, nothing really using that water, so it's hard to evaporate a lot of water at this season. So yeah, you're right. Given that we're getting into the cold season, we tend to retain a lot of that water that we have in the landscape right now.
Yeah.
There is a question from Bryce Anderson. I don't know if you saw that, Doug.
Okay.
Maybe you just regarding a guesstimate, an estimate perhaps about the blizzard losses in the Dakotas in corn and soybeans. So I know we talked about crop yield losses in general, but pertaining to the blizzard in particular, Bryce, I know only like 5% of corn is harvested in South Dakota, but from what I've heard, some early reports, there have been some low test weights. So even if you have a lot of kernels, that they're small, and I think that could be one issue that we're going to see here with this frost or freeze that we just had. That, like Brad said, will essentially end the kernel size on that. And as we have long duration moisture in the field, you could see lodging, those stems tipping down and causing some harvest difficulties in the corn. And I've heard this also in sunflowers, actually. If you get a high wind event now, that could blow a lot of the crop down. And that's another issue when you get into harvest and quality as well. And then and the soybeans, Brad showed a lot of the leaves have dropped, and I've seen that out around this area. So hopefully they can hold in. But again, I think that's going to be a quality issue up this way the longer it stays out there. I don't know, Brad or Dennis, if you have something else to add.
If we go back to 2009 for a comparison, since that's one that's where we're comparing to, I mean, what you're having to do for harvest is waiting until soil freezes, and then it's solid enough to get equipment out and get crops out. You can't get into a situation where you have snow and you can't get crops out. So that year there were a decent amount of corn that was not harvested until the spring. And I did interact with some folks who harvested in the spring, and they were not that upset with what they got out of it. They said the crop had dried down over the winter. They lost a little bit of yield, but given everything, they weren't too upset. So that could very well be a situation we deal with. We don't know what we have until the spring in some cases.
Is there anything else in all the information that you received, Laura, was there anything about the Mississippi River per se that, or anybody actually, they want to say about how high it is or low it is, or it's back into flood and all that kind of business?
I didn't receive too much more detail. I mean, the long duration of the flood levels are really unusual this year. That's true all across the region. As I think a lot of the, from the Missouri downstream, it's been in flood since March 13th at some level. So really long duration. But, and I know earlier this season, Dennis has known this too. Earlier in the season, we saw a lot of records set as far as levels go. But not a whole lot just now other than that.
Okay.
Well, pulling up the information from the Mississippi right now, along between Iowa and Illinois, moderate flooding, except for in the Burlington area, which is at major flooding. Because those are the areas where you've had this heaviest rainfall and you're still getting draining from the tributaries in that area. Not a hydrologist by any means, but they still have a lot of water they're trying to move downstream also.
Right. Okay, I know we have Kevin Lau on the phone. I don't know if he's listening or not. If you want to raise your hand and say anything about the Missouri Basin per se, Kevin from the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center, you may. I'll hold on. Any other comments in terms of? Oh, he's listening to me. I can tell. There he goes. Hey, Kevin, can you hear me?
Hey, Doug. Can you hear me?
I can. You want a quick comment about either the persistence of flooding or I don't want to put you too much on the spot, Kevin, but the concern going into the fall, just generally from your point of view?
Yeah, I'm very concerned about 2020. As has already been said, we're going into the winter wet, and I have legitimate concerns that some locations won't fall below flood stage between now and next runoff season, especially along the James. So, the setup is bleak as far as I'm concerned.
Right, and some of the conditions that would lead to, and I guess enhanced concern would be a greater than normal plains and mountain snowpack, something we need to watch, right?
That's exactly right. And, today's outlook was not encouraging in that respect.
Right. Yeah, and I guess I'll mention it again. Laura showed the maps, the seasonal outlooks for November, December, January, and she showed December, January, February. Looking beyond that, January, February, March, and March, April, May, in other words, out 6 months, actually cools things down across the northern part of north central part, let's say North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, in terms of likelihood of cooler than normal temperatures, and then keeps sort of that same band, if you will, from Montana east of above normal probabilities of precipitation through the fall and into spring. So it's a concern, and I just want to make sure we all know that. And we'll have to come back and look at it again in about a month or so.
Here, Doug, let me follow up on one more thing on the Mississippi. Mentioned the issue between Iowa and Illinois. The Mississippi's in minor flood stage between Missouri and Illinois, all the way down to where the Ohio comes in, and then it's not an issue below that because the Ohio is actually at low stage levels before where it comes into the Mississippi. So we actually have very limited water coming in right now from the Ohio. Some rains recently are starting to resolve that, but just looking at the hydrographs here where the Wabash comes in and some of those issues. So.
Yep. Okay. I think at this point we better wrap it up. There was one more comment about comparing it to 1993. There's a few years we could draw analogs to, but '93, if you all remember, was quite a big year on the Mississippi and Missouri as well. Anything else? Anybody? Okay. Well, I want to thank all the speakers for helping out on this this month's presentation. We'll do it again, not with Brad, because Brad's job is over till next year. But anyway, thank you, Brad and Laura and Dennis, for your comments, and thanks to the audience for your great questions and interest. At this point, we're going to sign off.